Medic Desmond Doss was beaten black and blue in the barracks. Seeing Desmond's bruised state, SGT Howell feigned concern and asked, "Can you identify your attacker?" Desmond didn't bother to respond, simply giving him a look. SGT Howell asked suspiciously, "Can you confirm who did it?" Desmond graciously replied, "No one actually hit him, he just fell." However, the real reason was that he had been brutally beaten by his roommates the previous night. The reason behind this was his reluctance to handle a gun. Because of this, he was either bullied by fellow soldiers or humiliated by being shown photos of his girlfriend. Even his humble pleas earned him no respect. Even when he was due to return home on leave, he was refused, his superiors insisting he prove he could handle a rifle. Yet, Desmond remained steadfast. "I will never touch a gun. Even if threatened with imprisonment, I will not waver." The reason for his leave was to marry his fiancée. As a result, Desmond not only missed his wedding, but was also confined to the military base. This time, the emotions he had long suppressed finally erupted. Desmond hated himself for missing the wedding of his beloved girl. However, even after being court-martialed, Desmond remained steadfast in his convictions. He had originally joined the military to save lives, not to take them. When the world was falling apart, Desmond simply tried to piece it back together. Desmond's unwavering conviction stemmed from two experiences. As a child, he often played and fought with his brother, but once he was too rough, nearly causing a disaster. Seeing his severely injured brother lying unconscious, Desmond felt a deep sense of remorse for the first time. He gazed at a painting of the Lord's Prayer and the Ten Commandments hanging on the wall, which depicted Cain, club in hand, standing over the body of his brother Abel. Desmond was deeply moved by this scene, and from then on, he resolved never to harm another. Desmond's father, Tom, was a World War I veteran. He was the only one in his entire company to survive. As a result, Tom suffered from combat trauma syndrome, relying on alcohol to numb himself. However, when Tom was drunk, he lost his mind. Once, Desmond grabbed his father's gun and nearly shot him dead. Under his mother's pleading, Desmond finally regained his composure and vowed never to touch a gun again. That day, he encountered a man with a ruptured artery in his leg. Desmond immediately used his own belt to stop the bleeding, then hailed a car and took the patient to the hospital. The doctor praised him, saying, "Thanks to Desmond's measures to stop the bleeding, the patient would have died." Desmond was overjoyed at the compliment. Seeing the hospital beds filled with patients, he suddenly felt as if he had found the purpose of life. Not only that, he also found his life partner. Seeing the angelic nurse, Desmond couldn't help but walk towards her. After confirming that the woman was a phlebotomist, Desmond approached her under the pretext of donating blood. Every day after that, he found various excuses to come to the hospital. Over time, with his outstanding appearance, Desmond finally won Dorothy's heart. However, just as they were about to get married, Desmond suddenly had the idea of joining the military. It turned out that his brother had suddenly appeared in uniform a few days earlier, determined to carry on their father's legacy. The older brother wanted to join the army and contribute to his country. However, both his parents disagreed. The father, well aware of the bloody cruelty of the battlefield, believed that going to war meant death. The mother, a devout Christian, did not want her son's life to be in danger, let alone harm others on the battlefield. But the older brother believed that going to war was not about killing, but about protecting lives. Desmond witnessed all of this, and he began to think about joining the army as a medic. Though Dorothy was reluctant, she ultimately accepted Desmond's decision. The two agreed to get married during Desmond's first leave. Afterward, Desmond visited his father at the cemetery. He told his father about his enlistment, and Tom, angered by his two sons, nearly lost his mind. Tom did not want to see his son in the cemetery. He considered Desmond's philosophy of saving lives, not taking them to be sheer nonsense. But now everything was set in stone, and there was nothing he could do. Before leaving, Dorothy gave Desmond her Bible, along with her photo and well wishes. In her eyes, Desmond was an extraordinary man, like a savior with a heart for the world. Soon after, Desmond arrived at a new recruit camp. Desmond thought he would be assigned to the medical department, but due to a unit error, he was assigned to the infantry company. Reassignment was now impossible, and upon entering the new recruit company, he witnessed its unusual nature. A new recruit was working out completely nude, a scene of profound ugliness. Two muscular men were throwing knives at each other, a dangerous scene. SGT Howell's sudden arrival caused a knife to pierce his foot. SGT Howell was brutally cruel to the soldiers, not only pulling the knife from their feet, but also ordering them to continue their training as usual. As for the recruit who liked to be naked, SGT Howell did not allow him to train with clothes. He had always believed that in order to quickly acclimate the new recruits to the brutality of the battlefield, they must be exposed to all manner of humiliation and reprimands. That day, SGT Howell was teaching the new recruits how to tie a self-rescue knot, designed to ensure a smooth landing from high altitude. Desmond had his own unique way with the double hitch, but SGT Howell mocked him. However, this was only the beginning of SGT Howell's harassment. That day, SGT Howell asked everyone to choose a rifle. Everyone stepped forward, but Desmond remained motionless. The only remaining rifle caught SGT Howell's attention. SGT Howell approached Desmond and demanded to know why he hadn't picked it up. Desmond apologized and said he couldn't touch a gun. He was then taken to Captain Glover's office. Desmond told Captain Glover that not only could he not handle a gun, but as a devout Christian, he would not attend training on Saturdays, the Sabbath. Captain Glover couldn't help but laugh at this. Once in the barracks, Desmond had only two choices: either obey his superior's orders unconditionally, or the military would dismiss him for mental illness. However, a psychiatrist's diagnosis revealed that Desmond had no mental illness. As long as Desmond passed the training, he could become a medic. But in Captain Glover's eyes, cowards weren't worthy of being in his company. Soon, Desmond was isolated. While other soldiers were conducting firearms training, he could only stand by bewildered. He was responsible for all toilet cleaning. Furthermore, Sergeant Howell deliberately made things difficult for him, overturning his bed and then punishing the entire company for substandard hygiene. Gradually, his angry comrades began to retaliate against him. Not only did they assault and insult him in person, but they also took away photos of his girlfriend to humiliate him. However, this was just the beginning. That night, while Desmond was asleep, a group of his comrades dragged him from his bed and proceeded to violently beat and kick him. By the time a comrade turned on a light, they had already fled. Everyone urged him to leave the barracks immediately, saying that since he couldn't even lift a gun, he shouldn't implicate others. When S.E.T. Howell arrived the next day, he saw the blood-stained bed and Desmond covered in wounds, and immediately understood what had happened. He couldn't bear to see Desmond tortured like this, so he urged him to leave. However, Desmond calmly replied no. S.E.T. Howell demanded that Desmond identify the person who had caused his injuries. To everyone's surprise, Desmond steadfastly denied that his comrades had done it, insisting that he had fallen while sleeping poorly. At this moment, none of his fellow soldiers, filled with guilt, considered Desmond a coward. That day, all the new recruits received their first leave. But just as they were going through the leave paperwork, a stern-faced officer suddenly appeared. He refused to grant Desmond leave, citing his failure to complete the rifle test. Unless Desmond could demonstrate proficiency with a rifle on the spot, he would be court-martialed for refusing military service. Desmond remained steadfast in his principle of not handling a gun, so he was confined to the solitary confinement cell. Even Dorothy hadn't seen Desmond yet. The priest consoled her, saying, "Some men always desert." But Dorothy was convinced that Desmond would never do that. Even in captivity, Desmond remained steadfast in his principles. At this point, Dorothy approached Desmond, suggesting that he pretend to pick up a gun as a cover. But in Desmond's heart, faith could not be scorned. If Desmond couldn't uphold his own beliefs, what was the point of living? Dorothy felt helpless about this. She fell in love with Desmond precisely because he never pretended to be himself. The next day, Desmond was brought before a military court. Desmond could never understand why he was charged with criminal charges simply because he had been motivated by the desire to save someone, even though he had undoubtedly refused to carry a gun. Desmond had no choice but to confess. Just as he was about to be sentenced to prison, Desmond's father suddenly appeared. Tom, dressed in his World War I uniform, handed a letter to the presiding judge and then walked out of the courtroom. After reading the letter, the presiding judge unexpectedly released Desmond on the spot. It turned out that yesterday, seeing her persuasion was ineffective, Dorothy had called Desmond's parents for help. Tom, understanding Desmond, immediately donned his World War I uniform upon learning of his son's predicament. Tom humbled himself and went to visit his former superior. A letter from his superior not only secured Desmond's commission as a medic, but also granted him the right to remain unarmed. And so, Desmond and Dorothy finally got their wedding. In the blink of an eye, it was May 1945 and Desmond's company was deployed to the battlefield. This was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, the Battle of Okinawa. At first, the comrades were all laughing and joking, completely unaware of the cruelty and horror of war. However, as they watched vehicles laden with the remains of fallen soldiers slowly return from the front lines, all the laughter and joking ceased. For a moment, there was no sound except the roar of car engines, because their mission was to relieve the company before them. Then, the new recruits arrived at a dilapidated house to rest. There, they encountered the medics from the 96th Company. Including Desmond, they were the only 3 medics left in the entire war zone. War seemed like a lion with its maw gaping, ready to devour every life. The Japanese attack was even more fierce than a lion. They would charge recklessly, their frenzy like a pack of mad beasts. After a brief rest, the new recruits finally reached their destination, Hacksaw Ridge. It was a sheer cliff face, requiring a rope ladder to climb. At that moment, the Navy was suppressing the Japanese troops on Hacksaw Ridge. Gazing at the raging artillery fire from the sky, each soldier felt a wave of trepidation. At the commander's command, it was their turn to attack. Blood dripped down the soldiers' bodies as they climbed, and for a moment, they were too frightened to look up. One could imagine the horrific situation above. But once they reached Hacksaw Ridge, they were met with a dead silence. The entire ridge was shrouded in fog, and they had no idea where the Japanese had gone. They could only advance cautiously and slowly, each step a new corpse and rats scurrying about. One new recruit had just reached a corpse when it suddenly sat up. Just then, a flying bullet instantly pierced both of them. Instantly, hellish torture descended, with a hail of bullets and artillery fire all around. Some were pierced by bullets, others were blown away by artillery fire. Instantly, limbs and feet were broken, blood splattered, and calls for a medic echoed. One new recruit, Smitty, lifted the half-dead body from the ground and advanced. He then used grenades to eliminate a large number of the enemy. A Japanese soldier attempted to attack him, but another comrade tackled him, and a struggle ensued. Only after Smitty shot the soldier dead did he recognize his comrade as the unarmed Desmond. In the past, during training camp, Smitty and the others had bullied Desmond, mistaking him for a coward. Now, they saw his true bravery. Desmond then desperately continued to save lives. He found a soldier whose legs had been blown off and quickly applied tourniquets to both legs. A nearby military doctor, upon seeing the wounds, told Desmond to give him a dose of morphine and leave, as he wouldn't survive a day with such injuries. However, the wounded soldier pleaded with Desmond not to abandon him, saying his wife and children were waiting for him at home. Desmond firmly promised to take him home and quickly carried him to the edge of the mountain. But his comrades thought he wouldn't make it down there, and Desmond was furious. "Are you sure? Let him down." Even if there was only a sliver of hope, he wouldn't give up. And then, without hesitation, Desmond ran back to the battlefield. The battlefield was now filled with wailing, cries for help, and cries intertwined. Desmond bravely navigated the hail of bullets, braving intense enemy fire, repeatedly saving his comrades from the brink of death. As the battle line advanced, the comrades finally reached the bunker. The intense firepower made it difficult for them to move forward. To continue, they had to find a way to destroy the bunker. One soldier launched a rocket launcher at the bunker, but it was ineffective against the hardened structure. Then, two soldiers, carrying explosive packs, took turns advancing. Under the powerful fire of his comrades, Smitty ignited the packs and threw them directly into the bunker. With a powerful explosion, the bunker was instantly razed to the ground. The Japanese defenses began to crumble, and the Americans immediately launched a charge. After a fierce charge, the Americans finally managed to capture a small section of Hacksaw Ridge. After the fighting subsided, the comrades began to clean up the battlefield and then took turns to rest. But Desmond couldn't stop, as there were too many wounded on the battlefield waiting to be rescued. By late into the night, Desmond had lost count of how many he had saved. The faces of the comrades resting in the trenches were filled with exhaustion. The comrades who had been chatting and laughing that morning were now mostly cold corpses. Smitty confessed his guilt to Desmond. Smitty expressed his deepest apology for his recent actions, and the two men smiled and reconciled. From that moment on, they were brothers, sharing life and death together. Rats gnawed at the rotting corpses all around them while they chatted in the trenches. The next morning, while most of the American troops were still asleep, the Japanese suddenly launched a fierce attack. They passed through the tunnels and instantly appeared before the Americans. The hordes of Japanese troops surged like a tide, catching the unsuspecting Americans completely off guard. Captain Glover could only request naval fire support and then order an immediate retreat. But the enemy's frenzied attack caused his comrades to fall one after another, with only a handful able to climb down the cliff. In such a life-or-death situation, even the slightest delay could mean death. One flamethrower, attempting to shield his comrades, had his gasoline barrel behind him explode, burning to death. Some wounded soldiers refused Desmond's offer of help, asking him to help wounded soldiers in greater need. Smitty had a chance to escape unscathed, but to buy time for his comrades behind him, he was shot through the chest and fell heavily to the ground. Thankfully, Desmond saw what was happening and rushed over. He picked up Smitty and frantically ran towards the cliff. However, by the time he reached the cliff, Smitty had already stopped breathing. Looking at Smitty's death, Desmond collapsed, and he asked God for guidance on what to do next. At that moment, looking behind him, he suddenly heard a comrade's cry for help. At that moment, Desmond's eyes grew resolute. Amidst the smoke, he slowly stood up and gathered his equipment. While his comrades had already retreated, Desmond resolutely chose to go against the flow. He decided to return to the battlefield and rescue more wounded comrades. He then dodged artillery fire while searching for the wounded. Meanwhile, Captain Glover began to count the remaining men. Of the hundreds who had gone up with him yesterday, only 32 remained, including the wounded. He had no choice but to temporarily retreat with his team to the rear base, leaving only 2 soldiers to man the sentry post. At that moment on Hacksaw Ridge, Desmond quickly found a wounded soldier. Just as he was about to drag him away, a hand suddenly grabbed him, another wounded comrade. Desmond instructed the wounded man to hold his hand to the wound and promised to come quickly to rescue him. Desmond quickly dragged another wounded man to the edge of the cliff. Desmond stared at the sheer cliff face, still puzzling over how to safely transport the wounded down. Just then, he spotted a rope nearby. The double-hitch knot, previously ridiculed by SGT Howell, now came into its own. Desmond expertly secured one noose around the wounded man's leg and the other securely around his torso. Then, using himself as a fulcrum, his hands firmly grasping the rope, he carefully lowered the wounded man down. The 2 soldiers stationed at the foot of the mountain were startled by the sudden development and watched as one wounded man after another was brought down. Though they didn't know the identity of their rescuers, they raced to get the wounded to the hospital and quickly reported the situation to their command base. Upon learning of this, Captain Glover immediately ordered the Navy to suspend the bombing operation. However, as the bombing cover was lifted, the Japanese reappeared from the underground tunnel. The Japanese soldiers immediately opened fire upon discovering the surviving American soldiers. Hiding behind the bunker, Desmond could only watch as his comrades, who should have been saved, were brutally slaughtered by the Japanese, unable to do anything. At this moment, he desperately wished he could save just one more wounded soldier. Just then, Desmond heard a cry for help not far away, but the sound had also attracted the attention of the Japanese. To ensure the safety of his comrades, Desmond quickly crawled over, buried the wounded, and then covered himself with another corpse. The 2 men stared at the Japanese soldiers passing by, not daring to breathe. Suddenly, a Japanese soldier turned and stabbed the corpse on Desmond's body. Fortunately, the knife only pierced Desmond's clothes. After the Japanese soldiers left, Desmond quickly dug his comrade out and quickly dragged him to the edge of the cliff. Faced with the Japanese sweep, Desmond refused to retreat, instead searching for an opportunity to rescue his surviving comrades. However, the Japanese soon spotted him. Panicked, Desmond quickly slipped into an underground tunnel. The Japanese threw a grenade, but Desmond reacted quickly and managed to escape the blast. However, the Japanese were still refusing to give up. Desmond then hid from the Japanese in the tunnel until nightfall. Having narrowly escaped, Desmond emerged from the tunnel again. The Japanese had already retreated, buying Desmond valuable time to rescue his comrades. Soon, Desmond spotted a wounded soldier with both eyes covered in blood. He immediately rinsed his eyes with water. When the soldier saw Desmond, a look of excitement filled his eyes. On the battlefield, some wounded soldiers lost their legs, while others fell into comas. Desmond, however, refused to abandon any of them, safely transporting them to the base of the cliff. As the night deepened, Desmond grew exhausted, his steps becoming unsteady. Desmond's palms, bruised and bloody from the ropes, continued to pray, "Let me save one more, one more." The wounded were continuously transported to the rear hospitals. His comrades, unaware that it was Desmond who had saved lives on Hacksaw Ridge, simply claimed that a madman was constantly saving the wounded. By this time, Desmond had already transported dozens of wounded soldiers, including several wounded Japanese soldiers, but unfortunately, none of them survived. When dawn broke, the Japanese troops once again emerged from their camp to clean up the battlefield. At this point, Desmond discovered the wounded Sergeant Howell and another comrade. Risking his own life, Desmond resolutely carried his wounded comrade on his back and escorted him safely to the bottom of the cliff. However, when he returned to rescue SGT Howell, he was unfortunately targeted by a Japanese sniper hiding in the shadows. A bullet grazed his helmet and passed through his head, bringing Desmond to a close. He then began to grope his way forward through the trenches. When the enemy sniper's position was once again exposed, SGT Howell shot him down with a single blow. The gunfire quickly attracted the attention of the Japanese, and Desmond snatched SGT Howell's rifle. However, instead of repelling the enemy with his rifle, he wrapped the man in a piece of cloth, creating a makeshift stretcher. He then lifted SGT Howell onto the stretcher and, frantically, ran, dragging it along. SGT Howell coordinated his fire from behind, and with the 2 men's coordinated attack, they quickly reached the cliff's edge. Desmond quickly used a double-hitch noose to slingshot SGT Howell. As the enemy drew closer, Desmond kicked SGT Howell back down. Desmond then struggled to hold onto the rope, his hands practically burning, and finally secured SGT Howell's safe landing. Seeing the Japanese approaching, Desmond still managed to secure Smitty's body with a rope and then leaped down with it. However, the rope wasn't long enough and he didn't land. At this point, the Japanese had already reached the edge of the cliff. Led by SGT Howell, his comrades trained their guns on the Japanese. As more and more comrades joined in, any Japanese who showed their heads were shot down, and soon no one dared to show their heads again. The comrades quickly caught Desmond. Desmond, so nervous, didn't realize he was safe. The touch of his comrades suddenly startled him. Gazing at the soldier he had once called a coward, Captain Glover's throat choked with sobs, and he was speechless. After confirming he was unharmed, Captain Glover immediately ordered everyone to take him to the medical tent. Then, all his comrades made way for him. They all looked at Desmond, their eyes filled with admiration and gratitude. Faced with such a hero, they dared no longer disdain him. Desmond washed the blood from his body with clean water and bandaged his wounds. Looking at the wounded before him, Desmond felt a warm feeling in his heart. But after learning that some of his comrades had not yet been saved, he sat alone outside the barracks, reading from his Bible. Soon after, Captain Glover came to visit. Captain Glover confessed that he had never misjudged anyone so badly in his life, and begged Desmond for forgiveness. But tomorrow they had to take Hacksaw Ridge. For Desmond, tomorrow was the Sabbath. He should not have been in the battlefield. But for his comrades, none of them were willing to go up without Desmond. The next day, at the foot of Hacksaw Ridge, the soldiers who should have charged 10 minutes earlier blatantly defied orders. They all gazed solemnly in the same direction, Desmond, in the corner, praying earnestly for them. Only when Desmond, having finished praying, turned around did Captain Glover seem to receive a signal. With a single command, the soldiers climbed Hacksaw Ridge once again. This time, they were fearless, for they all firmly believed that Desmond could lead them home. In an instant, the battlefield was filled with smoke and wailing. The Japanese, who had previously fought tenaciously, were now being defeated. Their commander, realizing defeat was inevitable, committed seppuku in the tunnel. A very small number of Japanese soldiers emerged from the tunnel, holding white flags. However, their surrender was not sincere. They desired to perish alongside the American forces. To protect his comrades, Desmond bravely stepped forward to help them avert danger. At a critical moment, an enemy grenade suddenly exploded in midair. The immense force of the blast knocked Desmond to the ground. Upon examination, he suffered only minor leg injuries and his vital signs were stable. Seeing the wounded Desmond, his comrades launched a desperate attack, ultimately securing Hacksaw Ridge at a tragic cost. Escorted by his comrades, Desmond was brought down from Hacksaw Ridge, still clutching the Bible. During the Battle of Okinawa, Desmond single-handedly rescued 75 wounded soldiers and was ultimately awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest honor in the U.S. military. Faith is the foundation of a person's spiritual existence. While beliefs vary, most align with the values of the times. Desmond, however, was a unique exception. Even amidst the hail of bullets on the battlefield, he consistently refused to use a gun in self-defense. While this behavior is often dismissed as a sign of mental disorder, it turns out that this very foolproof spirit is indispensable to our times. That's all for today's film. Please like, comment, and share. Thank you for your patience, and we look forward to seeing you again.